The brass nameplate on the lawyer's door read, Coleman and Associates. But what struck me wasn't the gold lettering. It was the silence that followed my footsteps down that mahogany hallway. At 73, I'd walked into plenty of rooms where I wasn't wanted. But this felt different. This felt like a courtroom, where the verdict had already been decided. And I was just there to hear my sentence. My name is Rosalind Hayes, and I spent 42 years teaching 3rd grade before retiring to care for my grandfather, Theodore, while my sister Camilla climbed corporate ladders in Denver, and my father Warren built his construction empire. I stayed home, changed bedpans, and listened to stories about the old country. They called me the spinster, the one who never amounted to anything, the one who wasted her life on someone else's dreams. But as I sat in that leather chair, feeling their eyes burn holes through my worn cardigan, I touched the sealed envelope in my coat pocket, the one Grandpa Theodore had pressed into my hands 3 days before he died. What they didn't know was that some inheritances can't be burned. Some legacies live in places fire can't reach. The first thing I noticed when I walked into that law office wasn't the mahogany furniture or the wall of diplomas. It was the way Camilla's Hermes perfume seemed to claim the entire room, marking her territory like a cat. She sat with her legs crossed, manicured fingers drumming against her designer purse, looking every inch the successful executive she'd become. Her husband Derek stood behind her chair like a bodyguard, his jaw set in that way that meant business was about to get ugly. My father occupied the head chair as if he owned the place, which, knowing him, he probably thought he did. Warren Hayes had spent his entire life building, demolishing, and controlling everything around him, including his daughters. He wore his best funeral suit, the one he'd bought for Mother's service 12 years ago, and his silver hair was slicked back the way he liked it when he was about to close a deal. The only thing missing from this family portrait was any sign they were glad to see me. "Rosalind," Camilla said, not bothering to stand. Her voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected in boardrooms, polite on the surface, ice cold underneath. "We weren't sure you'd make it. Traffic from the assisted living district can be so unpredictable." She glanced at my simple black dress, the one I'd worn to teach parent conferences, and I caught that familiar flash of superiority in her eyes. Some things never change, even when someone dies. I took the chair across from them, feeling the weight of the envelope in my pocket like a warm stone. "I wouldn't miss this for anything," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Grandpa Theodore was very clear about wanting me here today." The lawyer, Mr. Brennan, shuffled through his papers with the nervous energy of a man who'd clearly been briefed on family dynamics. He kept glancing at the door as if hoping someone else would walk through it and handle this for him. But what struck me most wasn't their cold reception, or the way they'd arranged themselves like a tribunal. It was the confidence in their posture, the way they sat like people who already knew how this story would end. They had no idea that the real story was just beginning, or that the woman they'd dismissed as the family failure was about to become the most important person in that room. Mr. Brennan cleared his throat and opened the leather folder with the care of someone handling dynamite. "The last will and testament of Theodore James Hayes," he began, his voice carrying the formal weight of 30 years in estate law, "written in sound mind and body, witnessed and notarized on October 23rd, 2024. I watched Camilla lean forward slightly, her eyes already calculating whatever numbers were about to be announced. Father sat perfectly still, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests. "To my granddaughter Rosalind Marie Hayes," Mr. Brennan continued, "I leave my entire estate. This includes the family home at 892 Oakwood Avenue, the woodworking shop and its contents, all financial assets totaling approximately $38,478,700. These include investments, real estate holdings, and antique furniture appraised at high market value." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Camilla's face went white, then red, then white again. Father's knuckles turned the color of old bone. "That's impossible," Camilla whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the number. "Rosalind hasn't worked a real job in years. She has no idea how to handle nearly $40 million. This has to be a mistake." She turned to Derek, who was already pulling out his phone, probably calling their lawyer. But Mr. Brennan shook his head, his expression professionally sympathetic but absolutely firm. "The will is ironclad, Mrs. Patterson. Your grandfather was very specific about his wishes." Father stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "You're telling me she now owns almost $40 million? That's theft, not inheritance. Rosalind manipulated him. She isolated him from his real family and filled his head with lies." He grabbed the copy of the will from the table and, before anyone could stop him, held his gold lighter to the corner. The paper caught fire immediately, curling and blackening as it burned. "There's your inheritance, Rosalind. Ashes." But as I watched those flames consume the document, something strange happened. Instead of panic or despair, I felt a calm settle over me like a warm blanket. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the envelope Grandpa Theodore had given me. Still sealed, still safe. "You're right, Father," I said quietly. "That inheritance is gone, but you just burned the wrong one. If this story is touching something in your heart, stay with me. There's so much more I need to share with you here." 3 days later, I sat in the bank where I'd had my checking account for 47 years, watching the teller's face shift from confusion to concern to something approaching fear. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but according to our records, Rosalind Hayes doesn't exist in our system anymore. She'd typed my name 3 times, checked my social security number twice, and even called her supervisor over. The woman who'd cashed my teacher's pension checks every month for the past 8 years was looking at me like I was a ghost." "That's impossible," I said, sliding my driver's license across the marble counter. "I've banked here since I was 26. I have my retirement account, my savings, everything." But the supervisor, a nervous young man with premature gray hair, just shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm showing that Rosalind Marie Hayes was declared legally deceased on November 7th, 2024. All accounts were closed and assets transferred to next of kin." The date hit me like a physical blow. November 7th, 2 days after Grandpa Theodore's funeral. I left the bank feeling like I was sleepwalking through someone else's nightmare. At the Social Security office, the DMV, even the library where I'd volunteered for 15 years, the story was the same. Rosalind Hayes had been erased from every system, every database, every record of official existence. Someone had taken a lifetime of carefully maintained documentation and made it disappear, as if I'd never been born. But the cruelest cut came when I tried to visit Grandpa Theodore's grave. The cemetery worker, a kind-faced woman about my age, checked her computer and frowned. "I'm sorry, hun, but the burial plot for Theodore Hayes is restricted access. Only immediate family members are allowed to visit." When I explained that I was his granddaughter, she looked genuinely pained. "According to our records, Mr. Hayes's only surviving relatives are his son Warren and granddaughter Camilla. There's no Rosalind listed anywhere." That night I sat in my small apartment, thankfully still in my name since I'd paid the rent in cash, and finally understood what had happened. They hadn't just burned a will, they'd burned me, erased me, made me disappear so completely that I was legally a non-person. But as I held Grandpa Theodore's envelope in my trembling hands, I realized something they hadn't counted on. Dead people don't have anything left to lose. I'd been staring at that sealed envelope for 3 days, afraid to open it, afraid to hope. But sitting in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of my own invisibility, I finally broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter written in Grandpa Theodore's careful script, the same handwriting that had taught me cursive letters at his kitchen table 50 years ago. "My dearest Rosalind," it began. "If you're reading this, then they've tried to erase you, just like I knew they would. Your father and sister always saw you as the weak one, the one who stayed home, the one who didn't matter. But I saw the truth. I saw the woman who gave up her own dreams to care for an old man, who read to me when my eyes failed, who held my hand when the pain got too bad. You were never weak, my dear. You were just quiet about your strength. The letter went on to explain what I'd suspected but never wanted to believe. 3 months ago, I overheard Warren and Camilla planning this entire scheme. They were going to have you declared mentally incompetent, then legally dead, so they could inherit everything without contest. Dr. Patricia Kendall, who used to work at the psychiatric hospital, agreed to sign the papers in exchange for a substantial fee. Your father has been planning this since your mother died. But then came the part that made my hands shake. However, I wasn't the senile old fool they thought I was. 2 weeks before my death, I transferred the house, the shop, and all my assets, including real estate holdings, stocks, and private sales, to a trust fund with you as the sole beneficiary. The documents are legitimate, notarized, and filed with the state. The copy of the will they burned was just that, a copy. The real will, along with all the trust documents, is in Safety Deposit Box 156 at Citizens Bank. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. I set the letter down and closed my eyes, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. But it wasn't just hope for money or property. It was hope that I existed, that I mattered, that I wasn't just a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. Grandpa Theodore had seen this coming and had protected me in the only way he knew how. Now it was time to protect myself. The last paragraph of the letter made me smile for the first time since the funeral. Rosalind, they tried to bury you alive, but remember what I used to tell you about the garden? Sometimes the strongest flowers are the ones that grow in the darkest soil. Show them what you're made of, my dear. Show them that you were never the one who was easy to forget. The key was exactly where Grandpa Theodore said it would be, taped under the bottom drawer of his old oak desk like a secret waiting to be discovered. I'd passed by that desk 1,000 times during my years caring for him, never knowing it held the key to my entire future. The safety deposit box at Citizens Bank was in a different branch across town, one where they didn't know Rosalind Hayes was supposed to be dead. Inside that metal box was a treasure trove of evidence that made my breath catch in my throat. There were the original trust documents, signed and notarized, transferring all of Grandpa Theodore's assets to the Rosalind Hayes Trust. There were bank statements showing the transfers had been completed weeks before his death. There were copies of every document Camilla and Father had forged, including my supposed death certificate signed by Dr. Patricia Kendall. But most damning of all was a small digital recorder. I pressed play with trembling fingers and heard my father's voice, clear as day. The old man's getting suspicious, but it's too late now. Kendall has already filed the paperwork declaring Rosalind mentally incompetent. Once he's gone, we'll have her declared dead and split everything 50-50. Camilla's voice followed. What about the staff at the nursing home? Won't they ask questions? Father's laugh was cold and calculating. Rosalind barely had any friends anyway. Who's going to miss the crazy spinster who talked to cats? The recording went on for 23 minutes, detailing every aspect of their plan. How they'd bribed the bank manager to close my accounts. How they'd paid off clerks at the Social Security office to remove my records. How they'd even arranged for my apartment lease to be terminated once they thought I'd have no way to pay rent. They'd planned my erasure with the same methodical precision Father used to flip houses. But as I listened to their voices plotting my destruction, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling hurt or betrayed, I felt a cold, clear anger that cut through all the confusion and self-doubt of the past few days. They'd underestimated me my entire life, and now they'd made their biggest mistake. They'd assumed I'd just disappear quietly. But Grandpa Theodore had taught me better than that. He'd taught me that the strongest people are often the ones who wait for the right moment to show their strength. I found Maria Santos exactly where I remembered her from, 30 years ago, behind the editor's desk at the Millbrook Chronicle, her grey hair pulled back in the same practical bun, her sharp eyes still missing nothing. She looked up from her computer screen when I knocked on her door, and I watched recognition dawn across her weathered face. "Rosalind Hayes," she said, standing up slowly. "I heard you were dead." "So did I replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. But it turns out reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. I'd known Maria since high school, back when she was the scrappy girl who wrote for the school paper, and I was the quiet one who helped her with research. We'd reconnected briefly during my teaching years when she'd covered school board meetings, but I hadn't seen her in over a decade. Time had softened her edges but sharpened her instincts. I told her everything about the will, the erasure, the recorded confession, the trust fund. I showed her the documents, played the recording, and watched her journalist's eyes light up with the fire of someone who'd found a story worth telling. "This is incredible, Rosalind. This isn't just fraud. It's a complete systematic erasure of a human being. Do you know how rare this is? How perfectly orchestrated?" She was already taking notes, her pen moving across the page with practiced efficiency. "I don't want revenge," I said carefully. "I just want to exist again. I want my life back." Maria nodded, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. "Rosalind, this story is bigger than just you. There are probably dozens of elderly people in this county who've been victims of similar schemes. Your father's real estate business, your sister's corporate connections. They have the resources to do this to anyone they consider inconvenient." By the time I left her office 2 hours later, we had a plan. Maria would investigate the network of corruption that had made my erasure possible, while I would work with a lawyer to restore my legal existence. But more than that, we would tell my story publicly, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a woman who'd refused to stay buried. "Rosalind," Maria said as I reached the door, "you're about to become the most dangerous person in this town. Are you ready for that?" The counterattack came faster than I expected. 3 days after Maria published the first article, "The Woman Who Came Back from the Dead," my father held a press conference at his real estate office. He stood behind a podium flanked by Camilla and Derek, his face the picture of wounded dignity. "My daughter Rosalind has been struggling with mental health issues for years," he announced to the assembled reporters. "This elaborate fantasy is just the latest manifestation of her illness." Camilla, polished and professional in her navy suit, stepped forward with tears in her eyes that looked genuine enough to fool anyone who didn't know her. "Rosalind has always been jealous of my success, of my life in Denver. When our grandfather died," she snapped, "she's created this entire conspiracy theory because she can't accept that he chose to leave his estate to family members who could actually manage it responsibly. The performance was masterful. 2 loving family members trying to protect their troubled sister from herself. But they'd underestimated Maria's thoroughness. The next day's Chronicle ran a devastating follow-up story, the paper trail of erasure. She'd traced every fraudulent document, every bribed official, every step in the systematic destruction of my legal existence. She'd interviewed Dr. Kendall, who'd been so shocked by the media attention that she'd confessed to everything. She'd found the bank manager who'd been paid to close my accounts, the Social Security clerk who'd deleted my records, even the cemetery worker who'd been told to deny me access to my grandfather's grave. The third article hit like a bomb. The recording that proves everything. Maria had cleaned up the audio quality and published a complete transcript of my father and sister planning my erasure. Their voices, their words, their casual cruelty, all of it laid out in black and white for the entire town to read. The comment section exploded with outrage, support, and dozens of people sharing their own stories of elder abuse and family betrayal. But the most powerful weapon in our arsenal wasn't the evidence or the media coverage. It was the simple fact that I wasn't hiding anymore. I walked through downtown Millbrook with my head held high, shaking hands with people who'd thought I was dead, accepting hugs from former students who remembered me fondly. I was no longer the invisible woman who'd been erased. I was Rosalind Hayes, and I was very much alive. Judge Patricia Henley had a reputation for being tougher than a $2 steak, and as I watched her read through the mountain of evidence in my case, I could see why. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of judge who'd probably seen every dirty trick in the book. When she looked up from the documents, her expression was one of barely controlled fury. "Mr. Hayes," she said, addressing my father with the ice-cold formality usually reserved for war criminals. "In 32 years on this bench, I have never seen such a calculated, systematic attempt to destroy another human being. The evidence presented here shows a conspiracy that goes beyond simple fraud. This is an attempt to commit what I can only describe as legal murder." Father's expensive lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but Judge Henley wasn't finished. The hearing lasted 6 hours. My father's team tried every trick they could think of, questioning my mental competence, challenging the validity of the trust documents, even suggesting that I had somehow forged my own grandfather's handwriting. But Maria had done her homework too well. Every piece of evidence was authenticated. Every witness was credible. Every document was ironclad. Camilla took the stand and tried to maintain her composure. But when the prosecutor played the recording of her voice, planning my erasure, she broke down completely. When Judge Henley finally rendered her verdict, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "The evidence presented here proves, beyond any doubt, that Rosalind Marie Hayes is alive, mentally competent, and the rightful heir to Theodore Hayes's estate. All previous documents declaring her deceased or incompetent are hereby declared null and void. Her legal existence is fully restored." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate freezing of all assets currently held by Warren Hayes and Camilla Patterson, pending a full investigation into this conspiracy." But as I walked out of that courthouse, I didn't feel the triumph I'd expected. I felt something deeper and more complex, a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served, mixed with genuine sadness for the family I'd lost along the way. They'd tried to erase me, but in the end they'd only erased themselves. The key to 892 Oakwood Avenue felt heavy in my hand as I stood on the front porch of my childhood home. I'd visited regularly while caring for Grandpa Theodore, but this was different. This was coming home as the owner, the one who belonged here, the one who would decide its future. The house looked exactly as I remembered. White clapboard siding, green shutters, the porch swing where Grandpa Theodore used to tell me stories about the old country. Inside, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through lace curtains that my grandmother had sewn 40 years ago. Every room held a memory. The kitchen where I'd learned to bake his famous apple pie. The living room where we'd watched old movies on Sunday afternoons. The bedroom where I'd read to him during his final months. The house felt like a time capsule, preserving not just furniture and photographs, but the essence of a life well lived. I found his favorite chair in the study, the leather worn smooth by decades of use. On the table beside it was the book he'd been reading when he died, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, the woman I'd been named after. She was a fighter, he'd told me once. Quiet about it, but fierce when it mattered. I understood now why he'd chosen that particular book for his final days. He'd been preparing me for this moment, teaching me that strength doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. The woodworking shop attached to the house was a treasure trove of memories and possibilities. Grandpa Theodore had collected beautiful things his entire life. Old tools, vintage machinery, furniture that told stories of families long gone. But walking through those rooms, I realized the real treasure wasn't the objects themselves. It was the love and care he'd put into preserving them, the way he'd seen beauty in things other people discarded. As evening fell, I sat on the porch swing and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in months, I felt peaceful, not because I'd won a legal battle or inherited money, but because I'd reclaimed something more valuable than any treasure, my right to exist, to matter, to take up space in the world. The house seemed to sigh with contentment around me, as if it too had been waiting for me to come home. 6 months later, I stood in the same living room, but everything had changed. The house was full of life again. The sound of women's voices, the clink of teacups, the rustle of paper as someone read a letter aloud. I'd kept my promise to transform 892 Oakwood Avenue into something special, something that honored both my grandfather's memory and my own hard-won wisdom. The Rosalind Hayes Center for Senior Women wasn't a business or a charity in the traditional sense. It was simply a place where women over 60 could come to remember who they were before the world tried to make them invisible. We had writing circles where ladies shared stories that had never been told. We had craft sessions where hands that had raised families and built careers created beautiful things just for the joy of it. We had a lending library stocked with books about strong women who'd refused to be silenced. But my favorite part was the letter-writing station in the sunroom. I'd furnished it with Grandpa Theodore's antique desk, good paper and fountain pens that felt substantial in aging hands. Women came there to write letters to grandchildren who lived far away, to old friends they'd lost touch with, to younger versions of themselves who needed encouragement. The walls were covered with responses, thank you notes, photographs, evidence that these women's words mattered to someone. Have you ever felt like the world was trying to make you disappear? Like your voice didn't matter because you'd gotten older? I'd love to hear your story. Drop me a comment and let me know if you've ever had to fight to be seen. Maria stopped by regularly, always with her notebook and her insatiable curiosity. She was working on a book about elder abuse in small towns, using my story as the centerpiece. But more than that, she had become something I never expected to find again. At my age, a true friend. We shared long afternoons over tea, remembering the girls we used to be, and marveling at the strength we'd found in the women we'd become. In a world that had tried to erase me, Maria had been one of the first to say, "I see you. You know what the most powerful thing about your story is," she asked me one afternoon, as we watched a group of women laughing over their craft projects. "It's not that you fought back. It's that you used your pain to create something beautiful for others." The simple wooden sign by the front door said everything that needed to be said. The Rosalind Hayes Center, where every woman's story matters. Below it, in my own handwriting, was a note I replaced every morning. If someone tried to erase you, write yourself back into existence, one word at a time, one story at a time. You matter. They say that when someone dies, they live on in the memories of people who loved them. But I learned something different. When someone tries to kill you legally, spiritually, or emotionally, you get to choose what rises from those ashes. You get to decide whether you'll disappear quietly or come back stronger than ever. My father and sister succeeded in erasing Rosalind Hayes from the official records, but they couldn't erase the woman who'd spent 73 years quietly building strength in the shadows. They couldn't erase the teacher who'd touched hundreds of young lives, the granddaughter who'd shown up when it mattered, the woman who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear. And just like in my classroom, I'd learned that the quiet ones often have the strongest voices. If this story has spoken to your heart, if you've ever felt invisible or forgotten, please know that you're not alone. Leave me a comment, share your own story. Let me know that you're still here, still fighting, still writing yourself back into existence. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about women who refused to be erased, I'd be honored to have you stay here with me. Your story matters. Your voice matters. You matter.